Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. In our last episode, we got to go inside the book by Angie McCartney entitled My Long and Winding Road. In that video, we saw Angie in her younger years and how it shaped her personality. In this episode, we'll see what life was like being married to the father of a Beatle. So let's get started. On the eve of Jim's birthday on July 7th, the Beatles were at a celebration party following the premiere of A Hard Day's Night. Princess Margaret and Lord Snowdon were there. Jim had a chance to meet Princess Margaret, but he lost his nerve at the last minute and turned the offer down. He didn't know what he would say to her. And just before midnight, Paul gave his dad a square package and said, "Go on, open it, Dad. Happy birthday." When he opened it, it was a painting of a beautiful brown gelding, and Jim said, "Thank you, son. It's a very nice picture." Paul laughed and told him it wasn't just a picture. He bought him the horse, and it was running at Antrim races on Saturday. Jim was shocked and happy. He loved horses and horse racing all his life. Now he was in the ranks of horse owners. The horse was named Drake's Drum, and Angie thought it was one of the kindest things that Paul could ever have done to make his father a horse owner. Angie said that early in their marriage, her husband Jim would tell her tales of his teenage years when he was a piano player in the pit of the local cinema in Clubmoor, Liverpool. The cinema held 2 performances a day. After the first show, Jim would go around the floor and pick up the programs that people had discarded. He would then cycle back home to Scargreen Avenue and iron them with his mother's flat iron and take them back in time to be resold for a second show. So he was kind of industrious. The music for the shows weren't planned, and the pianist was expected to be able to play something that suited the scene. Well, one day, Jim drew a blank because they were showing the funeral of the Queen of Sheba on the screen. The only thing he could think of playing was Horsey, Keep Your Tail Up. It was an old music hall song of the day. So that job sounded stressful, but Jim was talented, and Paul must have gotten his talent from his dad. Angie met Paul the night that Jim proposed to her. Ruth was in bed at their home in Rembrandt, the place that Paul had bought for his dad, and it was a modest 4-bedroomed house with only 1 bathroom. And it was in a very nice neighborhood, and was more fancy than Angie was used to. Angie and Jim sat on the long black pleather couch in the lounge room with its long burgundy velvet curtains, dark green carpet, and central fireplace, and they talked for hours about what they wanted to do with the rest of their lives. So Angie's life had been difficult with her husband's untimely death in a car accident, and Jim had been widowed 8 years earlier when he lost his wife Mary to cancer. He felt isolated in the lovely house, and it was lonely for him. It had views of the River Dee in North Wales. It also had a half-acre back garden where Jim could grow vegetables and flowers, and a greenhouse with vines for making wine. The constant fans going by made it hard for him to go out of the front of the house, so he relied on his sisters Millie and Jenny to come by every Monday to do his laundry, change his beds, cook, and look after him. He didn't want to hire a housekeeper. He never learned to drive, so routines like grocery shopping, visits to the post office, and the onset of arthritis made him less active than he would have liked to have been. They talked about their loneliness and their need to take the next steps. When Angie was playing the piano, she said Jim came up behind her, put his hands on her shoulders, and said, "I want to ask you something." And she looked at him and said the answer was yes. He laughed and said, "I haven't even asked you the bloody question yet." She supposed that was as close to a romantic proposal as she was going to get. They went back to the couch, and Jim said, "We both need to do something, but what would you like to do? Do you want to be my housekeeper? Do you want us to live together, or do you want to get married?" Angie said she would only want to consider marriage. She said she didn't want her daughter living with a mother who was living with a man she wasn't married to. Angie said she was pretty old-fashioned in those days. So this was okay with Jim, and he would have to let Paul know, as Paul had given him his Rembrandt home. The phone rang, and Jim said, "Hello, son." "Yes, she is. Yes, I have. Yes, we are. Just a minute, son. I'll put her on the phone." Angie said she was nervous, and she wasn't sure who was the most nervous on the phone, and she said a timid hello, and Paul said, "Hello, this is Paul." Then he said, "You sound nice," to break the ice, and he said he was going to drive up. Angie said at that time it usually took 3 hours to drive from London to Merseyside. Jim heard the Aston Martin coming up the gravelly driveway, and Jim went through the kitchen to open the garage doors so he could drive straight in and come into the house through the back kitchen. By that time it was early morning, so there weren't any fans hanging around. Ruth was washing teacups when he came in, and they exchanged greetings, and she put the kettle on. They talked, and then Paul asked Angie to get Ruth out of bed. Angie set Ruth on his knee, and she was rubbing her eyes. Then Ruth said, "I know who you are. You're on my cousin's wallpaper." Angie said she was mortified, but that broke the ice, and they all started to talk. And Ruth showed him her scar from her kidney operation 5 months ago, and Paul said that Ringo had appendix scars. Jim and Angie decided they wanted to get married right away, and Jim sent a car through the Mersey Tunnel for Angie's mom to come stay with them as a chaperone for a while. Paul had to get back to London for recording commitments, and Angie did Paul's laundry, and he was packing his things, and their mom made some sandwiches, a.k.a. buddies, and a flask of tea for the journey. A couple of hours after he left, Paul called from a payphone in Brown Hills and asked to speak to Angie's mother. He thanked her for the marzipan buddies. She didn't have her glasses on when she made them, and she thought it was cream cheese. On their wedding day a few weeks later, Paul sent them a telegram that read, "Wishing you a long life and happiness and lots of marzipan buddies." Jim and Angie got married on November 24, 1964, after taking a taxi from Rembrandt to a little chapel in Carreg, North Wales. They first went to St. Asaph Cathedral to pick up the license, and on the way they asked the taxi driver if he'd be willing to be their best man. He was thrown for a loop, but when they got to the rectory in Carreg, it was suggested that Gift Jones, the local gravedigger, be the best man, and Mary Bevan, the wife of the rector, be the matron of honor. Angie was a bit sad that no photographs were taken of the ceremony, and Buddy's wife Mary was the organist, and as they walked down the aisle, she played one of the Beatles songs, and they got the wedding march on the way out. After the ceremony, they had a few drinks across the road at the rectory and returned to Rembrandt in the taxi. When they got back to the house, Angie's mother, along with Jim's sisters Millie, Jenny, and Edie, were all there waiting. They had a wedding cake and some champagne from the Victoria Hotel in Heswall, just down the road from Rembrandt. They got a nice congratulatory telegram from Brian Epstein, wishing them a great future together. There was a small celebration, and the guests left early in the evening. They put Ruth to bed and sat in the lounge, finishing off the last of the champagne. When they went to bed, they saw lights flashing up at the bedroom window. The back garden at Rembrandt at that time led to an empty plot of land, and there were journalists and fans who had found out about the wedding. Luckily, Ruth wasn't disturbed because her bedroom was at the front of the house. Angie would try to keep Ruth out of the spotlight of Beatlemania. A Daily Mail journalist whom Jim dealt with before got through on the phone and arranged to come by the next morning to do an interview. Angie was nervous and a little excited. She said she was horrified the next day when the press boys arrived, and one of them followed her to the kitchen and tried to hit on her. She said, "Today I would have smacked him in the chops and given him a few choice words, but at that time she was afraid to do something wrong, so she shrugged it off and took a fresh tray of refreshments to the lounge." Christmas 1964, Jim, Angie, and Ruth went by train from Lime Street, Liverpool, to Euston Station in London to spend their first Merry Christmas with Paul and the Asher family. Paul picked them up in his Aston Martin and drove them to their hotel in Russell Square. As they were riding there, Paul and his dad were talking. So they were all in a traffic jam, and Paul slowly glided into the car in front of him. He touched the bumper. It wasn't a big collision, but the lady driver jumped out in anger and went towards the car. She banged on the window, and Paul slowly lowered it, and she went from "what the hell" to "can I have your autograph, please?" He gave her one, and she went back to her car in amazement. On Christmas morning, Ruth and Angie took a taxi to Mass while Jim relaxed at the hotel. When they got there, Angie gave the driver what she thought was a good tip, but the driver threw it to the pavement. He said, "Here, lady, you keep it. Obviously, you need it more than I do." She said, "Oops, my first real taste of the big city." So Christmas lunch was served at the home of Dr. Richard and Margaret Asher, the household Paul was living with at the time. The house was a dream. Margaret Asher carried in a turkey to the dining room table, and after eating the main course, they had brandy-soaked, lighted Christmas pudding with 6-penny pieces and little trinkets inside. It was like a true Dickinson Christmas. Along with Mr. and Mrs. Asher were their daughters Jane and Claire and their son Peter with his musical partner, Gordon Waller. Angie said that Ruth's face was a sight to behold. It was like a fairy tale. They all sang carols, ate, drank, and were merry, and they had presents for them under the tree. After the meal was over, they went down to the basement to burn the Christmas paper in the broiler. And Angie said that this was where, at a later date, Dr. Asher was found dead. So Jim, he really liked Dr. Richard Asher, and he spent time with him at Rembrandt. And they used to go for long walks together in Heswall Lower Village, and they would sit in the back garden and do crossword puzzles. As a memento of his visit, Dr. Asher sent Jim an Oxford English dictionary. Angie said she still has it. It was one of Jim's most treasured possessions. Jim wasn't very formally educated, but according to Angie, he was a gentleman and worldly wise. Jim was flattered to have the attention of a man who was so intellectual, with a good standing in the community and the medical research field. Dr. Richard Asher was a physician at the Central Middlesex Hospital. His wife, Margaret, was a professor of the oboe at the London Guildhall School of Music, and she taught George Martin how to play the instrument. She also taught Paul how to play the recorder while he was living at the top floor of their house in Wimpole Street. Angie, when she first entered their home, thought that she'd never seen so many books in her life. And on Boxing Day, Paul picked up Ruth from their hotel and took her to visit Alma Cogan, who was a very popular musical star. Ruth remembered that her place looked like a palace out of a picture book. It was said that Paul first played yesterday on Alma's piano. Angie said that Alma was only 34 when she died in 1966. Angie thought that London in the 60s was a magical time, and she felt that her and Ruth were privileged to have experienced the taste of it. Angie then talked about Mike McCartney. She said he was one of the gentlest, kindest, and most talented people on the planet. She felt that being the second son, he was never fully recognized for his God-given talents. Because Jim and Angie married quickly, Mike was away on tour with his group, The Scaffold. Angie later found out that Jim didn't let Mike know what had been going on with him and her, and Angie felt that he must have been shocked to find out he was getting a new stepmother and stepsister, and that they will all be living together at Rembrandt. He never showed the shock, dismay, or whatever he was feeling at that time to her. Around this time, Mike told Jim and Angie that he had met a young lady named Angela the previous night at a local club, and he was bringing her to meet them that afternoon. Well, they all liked each other, and Jim and Angie also liked Angela's parents, Edith and Frank. Frank liked playing the piano too, and they had many evenings at the Rembrandt house, Angela's parents' home, and Frank's golf club in Leoso. So Mike and Angie arranged their wedding, and that was at the same church that Angie and Jim got married in. Paul and Jane Asher stood for them as best man and maid of honor, and they bought Ruth a pageboy outfit. They had a reception at Rembrandt with a cast of thousands, and there was a lot of celebrities there. Mike and Angie moved a few blocks away to their own place called Sunset in the lower village of Heswall. Angie was a great cook and a homemaker, and they had 3 daughters, Benna, Theron, and Abby. Their marriage didn't stand the test of time, and they both moved on to other partners, other lives, and other pursuits. Angie said she would always remember those times with Mike as happy ones. He had a great sense of humor and whimsy. Angie remembered Tim Rice, who had been partnering with Andrew Lloyd Webber, telling her that he thought that Mike's talent surpassed that of Paul's, but with Paul having his success first, the world would never learn this fact. Paul produced an album for Mike called McGear, and they enjoyed working on the album together. And then Paul gave Mike a camera for his 21st birthday, and that started his love of photography that led to many successful books, exhibitions, and tours right through to this time. His ex-wife Angie passed away, but her spirit lived on with her grandchildren, and Mike remarried a lady named Rowena, and they had 3 beautiful and talented sons, Josh, Max, and Sonny. So I'm going to stop the video here. Angie and her daughter's lives changed for the better when she married Jim McCartney. They got to live in a nice home. They rubbed elbows with the rich and famous, and she got along well with Paul's brother Mike and his wife's family too. We found out what a kind man Jim was, and was always considerate, and consulted Paul when he decided to marry Angie because she would be living in the house bought for him. Angie, Jim, and Ruth had a spectacular Christmas that first year they married, visiting the Ashers' home where Paul was living at the time, and it sounded like a really special time, and it led to Jim becoming friends with Dr. Richard Asher, and that was neat. We got to see how close a bond Paul and Jim had, and that was nice to know also. So it's going to be even more interesting to learn more about Paul through her eyes, and to learn more about Paul's dad, who seemed like such a sweet man. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would really help the channel out. And I wish everyone a good day. Tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Bye.